Hi, welcome to today's Zoom meeting. My name is Deva Green, and we'll be facilitating a discussion about Pluto in the eighth house or Scorpio. And as always, I would like to make this as interactive as possible, so invite any questions about the material as they surface. I have found that it's best to ask the questions that you have when you have them to keep everybody on the same page. So, okay. Pluto Scorpio interface, that when we're looking at Pluto in Scorpio or Pluto in the eighth house, we're magnifying the eighth house archetype. We're magnifying the Pluto Scorpio eighth house because it's in its natural sign, the eighth house. Pluto is being filtered through the eighth house or Scorpio, which again is its natural house, natural sign. So when we are looking at a natal signature that has Pluto in Scorpio, Pluto in the eighth house, or also a preponderance of Scorpio energy in the natal chart, we're looking at a soul who is desiring to confront and also to metamorphose current limitations, that there's going to be an intensity of focus around understanding the why of things. And until that why is known, it seems that the eighth house will never really be satisfied. It's an ongoing dialogue of why life, why death, so on. And within that, by the soul essentially coming into life, then when we're looking at Pluto in the eighth house or Pluto in Scorpio, are souls that have developed a quite a bit of psychological knowledge. They're approaching life again from the standpoint of desiring to understand the why. And we have a whole generation in here of souls, at least in my perspective, who are um, very, who have an intensity of focus on understanding the bottom lines or understanding the why of things. It's like a desire to create metamorphose, which from within themselves and also externally. So many of these souls come in with a very deep psychological knowledge that I don't want to make a blanket statement, but it seems that it can surpass their years. Um, because again, with Pluto and Scorpio, it's what it's what these souls are coming into, their natural point of gravitation. So there's already been a focus on understanding the bottom lines of things, of wanting to metamorphose and wanting to purge limitations. And that develops a inherent psychological ability and also orientation that many of these souls can come in with. It's also a way of exposing or confronting oneself. And that dynamic can be projected externally. So sometimes these souls can create these really intense confrontations in order to expose their own limitations or in order to expose the why. It's like a way of magnifying the eighth house archetype. So, okay, moving on to the next slide. That there's a correlation to the soul and the dual desires that are within the soul, one to return and one to separate. So when we're magnifying this archetype, this is where this confrontation within the soul becomes the strongest or most intense. The desire to maintain the past, the desire to maintain patterns of the past that correlate to security on an unconscious level, or desires to purge those desires to metamorphose beyond the soul's current understanding of life, of metamorphosizing beyond current habits, compulsions, and so on, in order for that soul to grow to its full potential. And oftentimes, because Pluto correlates to the soul, and when we have it in the eighth house, these souls will naturally be coming in with a very intense laser beam type of stare at times, because it's like they're aware of the power, so to speak, that the soul contains. So when we're looking at this archetype, it's where that confrontation inwardly between the dual desires of the soul, the one to return and the one to separate, can become magnified. And so, with that, the soul again is always focusing on understanding the why of things. Because if we don't understand the why, then really no growth can happen. So, it's when we understand the why that we can then make the changes that we need to make in order for the soul to blossom or to generate into its heights. So when we're looking at Pluto eighth house and its correlation to the soul, it's where the soul will deeply feel these two antithetical yet coexisting desires, one to return and one to separate. Within that, then, is the dynamic of trust. It all starts with trust that oftentimes, when we're able to establish a bond of trust, either with others or even if it's with nature, with animals, you, amazing things, or it's like the sky is the limit. It really comes down to fostering that dynamic of mutual trust that allows a bonding, or that allows that Scorpio fusion to really happen. And one of the most beautiful stories that I just heard that really makes me think of this is a situation where a man encountered a she wolf that was caught in a trap. And she had pups, and he was doing everything he could to try and help this wolf, um, help her pup, but of course she wouldn't let him near. But he eventually established trust by bringing over the pups so they could nurse. Even camped out for a day, little by little, slowly gaining her confidence. And when that happened, she finally let him near. He trusted her, the she wolf, that she wouldn't hurt him because she had the pups, and she trusted him that he wasn't going to try and hurt her. And in so many ways, even though it seems so basic and so fundamental, when you're dealing with these issues of trust, or when you're have a stacked eighth house, or Pluto in the eighth house, or Scorpio, it is essential, well, as it would be with anybody, but especially when we're dealing with this archetype, to emphasize or to establish that bond of trust as a way to create a true merging, or to create a true fusion, osmosis, as Scorpio really loves to do. So when we're dealing with the dynamic of trust, that it really allows the inner the soul, two souls to really merge, to really bond in ways that there's nothing, there are no hidden dynamics, no ulterior agendas or motives. It's just one soul connecting to another soul. Everything's on the table, everything's transparent, and so on. So when there's the dynamic of trust, healings from prior wounds of abandonment, betrayal, and loss, and also misapplications of trust can happen from that. So when you're working with this archetype, it's emphasized to understand that many of these souls have come in with prior life woundings, and the need to establish that bond of trust for them to trust themselves, and for them to trust others is essential. Metamorphosis, that when we're able to uh, go to the depths and understand the deeper workings that are creating our limitations, then we can motivate ourselves to become a butterfly, in another way of speaking, to create metamorphosis beyond those limitations. And when we're looking at the Pluto 8th house Scorpio archetype, it very much is like a caterpillar who makes a cocoon and turns into the butterfly. That there's an absolute changing, or there's an absolute different structure. It's not an alteration. It's that there's a completely different form that's now been birthed or metamorphosed through the deeper workings of the eighth house to bring to the surface what's going on a core level, what's going on that what's going on more underneath versus on the surface, and again understanding the why. And from there the soul can then choose to rebirth itself, to jettison from patterns that are no longer serving, that are creating limitations and repetitive behavior and so on. So when we cooperate, or when we look at the Pluto 8th house, it's really emphasizing that dynamic of choice, that by bringing these things to the surface, not in a negative way, but by allowing oneself to be exposed to these deeper dynamics that are often uncomfortable, that's when the metamorphosis really happens. And that caterpillar can turn into the butterfly. So it is connected to the water trinity, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. And when we're looking at Cancer, we're focusing in on the self-image, how the soul, how the soul's conscious emotional body, or the water trinity in full is the totality of the emotional body. The Cancer archetype is security at a subjective level. So it's all those influences that contribute to the self image and the sense of security from there. With Scorpio, it's the desire to merge, or the desire to create union, in order to metamorphose. And when we're looking at Pisces, we're looking at connection to source, to eternal, to the universal. So progressively, the point of spiritual life is to shift the center of gravity of consciousness from ego to soul. So when we're looking at this Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, there's a progressive metamorphosis of the egocentric structure that happens as the soul progressively unites with source. So Cancer would be the self-image or the egocentric structure. Scorpio would be the metamorphosis and also the merging or the fusion. And Pisces is with the eternal or the source, in such a way that the soul is no longer identifying with itself as a separate entity. So looking at this water trinity, it's the emotional body in full, and describes or correlates to the natural shift from uh, the describes the natural metamorphosis that happens within the egocentric structure as the soul merges with the source. So it's important to look at all three of the water signs in the Trinity to gain a comprehensive understanding of the soul's emotional body and components that lend to emotional security factors. Yes, the why. It's always what the soul, the eighth house is always coming back to, is why. And that's something that we can help ourselves with, and also help others who are going through a tremendous evolutionary transition, or going through a time of growth, is to encourage a reflection upon the deeper the deeper the deeper whys of things, or the deeper understandings of what's the cause of these things, versus getting caught up in either the emotional feelings of betrayal, abandonment, or loss. Because so often the tricky point with Pluto and Scorpius can be when the rug gets pulled out, that a whole bunch of emotional dynamics from the past can become triggered from that. And rightfully so, it can be very difficult to experience a loss, or to experience a reoccurring event. And so this is all intended to bring a focus upon, or to bring the soul to ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Why does this person operate this way? Why do I operate in this way? The intention of the archetype is to focus upon the why, and again to develop a deeper psychological understanding because of the question why. Power and powerlessness, that's a core evolutionary lesson when we're looking at eighth house, is power, dynamics of being in power, and dynamics of experiencing powerlessness. And many of these souls have experienced, again, having identified with sources of external power that they're hoping, or that can create, that they're desiring to metamorphose, or it's an external link to power in order to grow bigger, or to transmute current limitations. And ultimately, what happens then is, when external sources of power have been relied upon, eventually through the second house polarity point, you get thrown back on yourself and experience powerlessness, or either having violations of trust, situations where you become very vulnerable through the experience of powerlessness. And the intention of both experiences, from my understanding, is the correct use of power. And where does power, asking that question, why, where does power come from in the first place? Is it something that's external to ourselves, or is it something that we can activate from within? Is it an inner power to say no to things that we know aren't good for us, and to say yes to things that, while they're difficult, we ultimately will serve us better in the end? So it's those kind of things, and or those kind of dynamics, and also experiencing both ends of the spectrum. So sometimes the soul can carry an inner knowledge of having abused power in the past, or coming in with an emphasized fear of exerting one's power because of that, not wanting to exert any influence at times, as a way of trying to counteract those unconscious memories. Looking at the eighth house archetype relative to power and powerlessness, aligning with an internal source, relying on one's inner power as well, um, instead of linking oneself to something external. And it can also be specific rituals, or these souls can come in with knowledge of larger forces, that they are becoming aware of forces that are larger than themselves from an egocentric point of view. And that also experiencing or inducing the sense of both power and powerlessness. And that can lead some to align with uh, um, gurus, or transcendent, or universal knowledge, or dynamics where they can fuse or merge with these external sources. And for some, it compels or drives them to create alliances with sources of power for manipulative needs. So, in the true spirit of Scorpio, it's all about the inner orientation, and or the inner orientation to power. For some, it's that these souls are trying to re empower themselves after many lifetimes of having the rug pulled out and learning the proper limits of power and so on. And with others, it's that a desire for power for purely manipulative purposes. So, looking at the chart in total and taking it in context in terms of what the soul's orientation for power is and uh, potential prior life experiences related to power and powerlessness. Karmic relationships, yes. So, from my understanding, that the eighth house Pluto Scorpio archetype does correlate to the dynamic of karma in the sense of one choice or one action leading to another action. And karma can be 100% positive or it can be 100% negative. It all depends upon what actions you've put forward prior to that point. So another way of saying that is you reap what you sow. And so when we look at the dynamic of karma, when we're looking at the eighth house, or also Pluto eighth house transits, the dynamic of karma, of reaping what we've sown, can come into play. So if we've made commitments in relationships, then that karma will come right back to us. And if we haven't been able to really commit ourselves in relationships, then that will come right back to us too. Um, and looking at marriage and the sexual experiences and so on that the eighth house can be attracted to. It's that desire to fuse or to metamorphose through creating union and through creating merging with others, whether it's through committed relationships or rituals such as tantra, where the soul can become bigger or the soul can merge and fuse in such a way that it becomes bigger and brighter than it once was. Yes, betrayal, abandonment, and loss. That often when we look at the eighth house too, it's the dynamic of investment. That often souls have put have either misapplied trust or invested emotional energies in sustaining dynamics of the past that are preventing stagnation. And so what happens then is that these sources become removed, either through betrayals, through becoming abandoned, or through loss. It throws us back on ourselves. It activates the Taurus polarity point, second house polarity point, to where those sources are removed with or without our cooperation. And it activates the dynamic of self sufficiency or self reliance. Um, that the soul is learning to trust its own inner power, so to speak, to learning whom to trust and whom not, and learning to de-invest when too much emotional energy has been put into areas that are creating limitations. And this is where manipulation can come through, is that oftentimes, in order to sustain or in order to maintain dynamics of the past that have created unconscious security, the soul can manipulate or become manipulative in order to sustain or to keep those dynamics in play, whether it's through a relationship, a career, or an example of this could be somebody in a relationship who always tries to make themselves feel indispensable, that they have some sort of psychological knowledge that the other person doesn't have. and can then prey upon, or can always kind of tune into the other person's weak link, again, in order to make themselves feel indispensable, or that to place themselves in a position of power in the other person's life. Um, that's one expression of how manipulation can take place, and it's to sustain those patterns that, again, bring the soul the deepest level of emotional security. It's like a way of saying, it's a way of sustaining the past through such manipulation. And that can go two ways too. That, on a humorous note, sometimes manipulation can take place to outthink, or to kind of play what do they call it? A reverse psychology, manipulation in a good way. Because it can be so darn intense with the eighth house. But manipulation can come into play here, because, again, the intention to merge, or the intention to osmose, to take in dynamics that the soul feels can bring it empowered, to an empowered state. And those are either used, and those can become manipulative, in order to, again, the intention is to throw the soul back on itself. That oftentimes the soul will either experience being used or manipulated, or the very same ulterior motives being reflected back to the soul in one way or another. Resistance, that the dynamic of resistance can surface here too, again, because when we're looking at the eighth house, Pluto Scorpio, this is where the deepest source of unconscious emotional security is symbolized. So the resistance to change, or the resistance to releasing those, to change those habits or patterns. It's the desire to sustain what's known. And I mean, how many of us like to embrace 100% insecurity? I think there would be very few of us that could raise their hands. From my understanding, it's that the dynamic of resistance can be emphasized at times in the eighth house, because of the amount of security that's linked to the past, that's linked with what's familiar and known. The resistance can come from the deep familiarity that can come from that, again, of the past leading to security. And when the soul does resist change to a high degree, or to an intense degree, can create situations of loss, of being abandoned, or in one way or another having the rug pulled out from underneath the feet, in order to help the soul, over time, grow beyond that, or to release the resistance that has been built up, relative to security. The deeper the level of resistance, it sets up the need for either Pluto type of experiences, or at the same time, the dynamic of cooperation, because we're looking at the soul, which again emphasizes cooperation and resistance. So the soul can also be re-energized through cooperating with whatever changes need to be made, and working through the more resistant parts. Obsessions, yes, when the soul is linked with external sources of power, or even taboo, can be natural attractions to taboo. can correlate situations where the soul can potentially grow or to understand a deeper dimension of oneself. And those can, if it becomes a hang up or if it's externally linked, that also what correlates to security can become obsessions. That these obsessions are linked with either situations that the soul has is desiring to have in order for transmutation and for growth to happen, or they symbolize what's known and familiar. So it can be these either these obsessive uh, attractions to what can either symbolize change to the soul, or they can be obsessions in that they become areas that the soul revisits again and again in order for security. They can become habits, at times compulsive patterns of behavior. So it's the fixity of the eighth house that it's either the desire to change and an intense interaction to what they feel can help them create that change, or it's because the intense desire to maintain the past and what's secure. They can become emotional obsessions. So it's not going to manifest the same for everybody. That we have to understand the context of the birth chart and of the person to make an accurate interpretation. And so the evolutionary states will determine how Pluto in the eighth house for Scorpio will be expressed is a contextual factor that we have to include. And looking at the consensus, then that the soul's psychological understanding will be very homespun, or can come through the more conventional psychologies, or conventional or mainstream understanding of life. Can be souls that are also attracted, very deeply attracted to breaking limits relative to social status, or to their social limitations, to either progress through the strata through deeply understanding how society is structured and the psychology. How do I get ahead? How do I get on top here? How is this culture put together? How is this society put together? How is the person at the top thinking, so that I can progressively how I can advance myself through that psychological understanding. So very much it's can be uh, of course re- defined by the consensus and mainstream, and the desire to metamorphose or the desire to transmute will come through progressively understand deeper layers of society. First, maybe the surrounding area or neighborhood or community, and then progressively it can come through the whole culture or the country, and then from that nations, or the different continents, or it can become like progressing to the very top, understanding how cultures other than the one it was born into, the psychology, how they're operating, and so on. So it progressively expands as the soul progresses from first to third stage, and with the desire to metamorphose and to understand the why coming through social progression and through mainstream psychology. When we're in the individuated state, it's understanding limitations relative to breaking out of psychology that's homespun or that's constructed by the mainstream, and desiring to understand who am I outside of the conditioning, so to speak? Why do I, what influences do I have that are connected to the mainstream? And many of these souls will be desiring to purge or to metamorphose beyond that, beyond the conditioning patterns. That they'll be attracted to experiences that go way well and beyond the mainstream, including taboo, in order to understand themselves as an individual, and in order to individuate, in order to metamorphose beyond the limitations of mainstream thinking in general. As an example, many of these souls can be attracted to alternative psychology, alternative rituals that help them, or that help would help us understand psychology from a individualistic or in an individuated sense. And when we're in the spiritual state, it's an understanding of spiritual archetypes in a sense, or an understanding of psychology that's linked to universal knowledge, that would help the soul also understand the source in a deeper way, perhaps through transmuting psychology that is fostered upon resistance from source. So understanding the egocentric blockages deeper, that could be the eighth house in the spiritual state, and merging or transmutating, growing past evolutions through merging with a transcendent or universal psychology. So before we move on to the example charts, are we all on the same page, or any questions or any comments about the eighth house?
Yes, Deva. Could you please explain cataclysmic evolution versus easy evolution in terms of Pluto in Scorpio?
Yeah, cataclysmic evolution, and non-stressful or uniform evolution relative to Pluto and Scorpio can come through the dynamic of cooperation and resistance. Sometimes the soul is, with Pluto in the eighth house, is desiring to confront and to transmute and do a lot of evolution in one period of time, which can create situations where there's more stressful, or can create situations that are highly Plutonian, highly intense and stressful. And in other situations, it's due to resistance. That the soul is trying to work through its resistance through programming situations of stressful cataclysmic evolution. So it's to propel a metamorphosis. It's to propel the soul towards metamorphosis, where they want, and to grow past those parts that have become stagnated. And so it can take that intensity to do that. And with non-stressful evolution, it can come through an understanding of why, of, let's say, for example, with Pluto and Scorpio, if they have a psychological understanding of what changes need to be made, and they can motivate themselves to do that, it can correlate to non-stressful evolution, a slow, steady, making a little bit of change each day. It can correlate to it can correlate to a uniform or non-stressful evolution.
Thank you.
Yeah, so okay, looking at the first example chart here, Jane Goodall, um, who primarily worked as a groundbreaking primatologist, through her deeper understandings of the emotional nature, and also the psychology of primates, namely chimpanzees. And Pluto is in the eighth house retrograde in Cancer. And one of the quotes that she has that I feel strongly illustrates this is because the chimpanzees, as she progressively gained their trust, they let her closer to observe them than almost anybody prior to that point, that she was able to daily observe them, make her notes, looking at the North Node in Aquarius in the second. Um, and they asked her in an interview, they said, "Well, as you worked with the chimpanzees and gained their trust, and was progressively included or adopted or invited in their tribe, um, would you say that it was love, or what was the core dynamic that facilitated that?" And she said, "I wouldn't call it love. I would more call it mutual trust." Um, that they let her in, or they allowed her to essentially become integrated in their group or their tribe, because there was mutual trust. She trusted that they wouldn't hurt her, and she trusted that they wouldn't hurt her, and vice versa. And from that, she was able to communicate, or she was able to, through observation, penetrate to deeper levels of awareness of their emotional nature. When babies were either abandoned by family, either through a loss of a mother, or she noticed that their emotional nature isn't that different from our own. That essentially at the root of it is natural emotion, as it is with all animals. And looking at the moon in Sagittarius in the 12th house, she was able to, with Pluto in the eighth, she was able to bring out their a deeper understanding of how they work and why, and that they're not just going on instinct. As an example, that she was the first to observe and to record their use of tools. That there's an incredible level of consciousness that most of us weren't aware of. And of course, she was met with a lot of skepticism at first, looking at Chiron in the sixth, and also seeing the Jupiter in Libra retrograde in the 10th, which is opposing the Sun, and also the Mars in Aries in the fourth. Um, she was told by those in authority that she was anthropomorphizing, or she was giving them too many human attributes. Namely, she wasn't supposed to give them a name. She was only supposed to talk about them relative to number. And of course, she wasn't going to do her research this way, because uh, with Pluto in the eighth house, and being in Cancer, and the moon in Sagittarius in the 12th, she could see how different they really were, in the sense of they all have their own personalities, North Node and Aquarius. And she wasn't going to report them as numbers, but rather as she was observing them, their emotional responses, their reactions, and so on. And looking at Saturn in Aquarius, and also the second house, um, it was a way for her to disconnect from situations of either being powerless, and perhaps the temptation to prove herself, or the temptation to have to prove that she was right, or to exert power in a distorted way. Because through observation, through sitting in nature, that she felt more at home there. She felt her own emotional regeneration happening just through the simplicity of it, second house, and just through what she was observing. So those dynamics of needing to exert or to prove, looking at the 10th, fourth house too, or she simply kept recording, and she kept reporting what she saw. And coming in there also as an unlearned, she was an unlearned woman. She had no prior credentials, no prior background. She wasn't conditioned by the current theories, looking at the 10th house that were in the existing universities, but she came there as an unlearned and unconditioned recorder. And that's really where her power came from, was not having to prove or not exerting or trying to challenge anything, but rather simply reporting what was. Simply every day writing this, writing that, seeing this happen, seeing that happen. And the point of that being that she did it in such a way that there was no way to refute it, or it devoided, or it nullified any potential conflicts of either prove it or what facts do you have, because she had become the observer. Um, Looking at the North Node being in Aquarius and Saturn in Aquarius, ruled by Uranus and Aries in the fifth, it's like a way of being able to regain her voice and her creative purpose was by shifting into more of a place where there weren't the power and powerlessness conflicts, but um, going out into nature, to simple environments, and being able to write what she saw. And looking at the Sagittarius moon being in the 12th house, from my point of view, and it's trying, or it's see, is it squaring? Um, oh, it's making let's see. Oh, I was connecting that to the South Node being in Leo in the 8th house, two fire signs, special purpose and special destiny, that it was a way to self-empower, was by becoming receptive, or by lending her voice, seeing the Mars and Aries, trining the South Node, giving a voice to those who weren't heard, or giving a voice to those who had none. Um, where Another beautiful quote by her is, "Where others have no voice, there I shall go singing." So looking at that 8th house and seeing the transmutation or regeneration that happens through the polarity point, 2nd house, it came through establishing her own self-sufficiency, establishing her own role that was very unique, considering the times, and conservation. Um, so she was able to self-sustain through liberating or breaking free from the traditional roles. And she essentially was able to navigate challenges with funding and financing through recording very, or through continuing to make the observations that were antithetical or disproved the current understanding of primates. So it was like a way for her to consolidate, to ground into her own role by breaking out of tradition, or breaking out of the norms. That was a way for her again to regenerate and to lend her voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. And has created a groundbreaking work that, looking at the Aquarius energy, is really linked towards a different understanding of nature, and specifically primates and our relationship to nature, conservation, and uh, an untraditional view for sure, that's created long-term change, seeing the Aquarius energy. So any questions about her chart, or the 8th house, 2nd house access, and um, how this was manifested for her?
Yes. What level of evolution would you say?
Oh, great question. From my understanding, she seems to be in the first stage spiritual. So Bob Dylan, he's also uh, in a true eighth house fashion, a soul who's really shaken and deepened our understanding of life itself, of of transmutation and of growth and our understanding of psychology and the why of things. It's all, from my point of view, he's definitely through his music been somebody who's been able to evoke or bring about deeper levels of awareness. And seeing the South Node being in Pisces in the third house, being somebody who is naturally able to tune into or a communicator of universal universal themes, universal messages. One of my favorite quotes by him, or one of my favorite songs, is "The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind." we're all we're all receptive, or we all have the power or ability to tune into or to harness, so to speak, or to fuse with these universal energies. It's not something from the external, but looking at Mars and Pisces in the second, and Pluto's polarity point being in Aquarius in the second too. It's a way to break free from limitations. It's from being receptive to these universal, or being receptive to universal messages that can come from within second house, or that can come from grounding into ourselves, internal uses of power, and looking at Gemini, or looking at Mercury and Gemini in the seventh house squaring the nodes, being able to communicate from many different perspectives, many different points of view, and from my understanding, able to convey or to deepen our understanding through these, being able to convey these different points of view. Um, I remember one confrontation that he had, especially with his music, is that a reporter came and said, "How would you classify, or how would you define yourself? Is this or that or the other?" in classic to Dylan, he said, "No, no labels. You don't put any harness, you don't put any labels on me." And from my understanding, that was just his way of saying that his music was it was going to shift, or it was going to change relative to whatever was coming through at that time. True Pisces, undefined. Pluto in the eighth house, don't put any limit on it. Gemini, don't put any classification. And his own process too of sorting out his personal truth, seeing the North Node being in Virgo in the ninth. Um, but looking at the second house, eighth house, and looking at this Mercury square, third, ninth house, definitely re-empowering through gaining, or by reconnecting to a message that wasn't fully brought out. Um, through the second house, as he was able to relate, or to identify, or to discern more and more what his personal truth was, and able to communicate without flip flopping. Or I think he was also known for definitely being able to play many different hats. That he was also able to deepen and develop his music through discernment of universal truths and personal truths, and progressively purge those parts that may have been filtered through, or that may have been osmosed from others that weren't really him. And that's also a powerful part of regeneration with Pluto in the eighth house, is through the second house, being able to release, or being able to purge the parts that have been osmosed from others that aren't really the soul, or that aren't really related, that again have been osmosed from others. And the second house can bring the soul closer to its inner relationship with itself through doing that. And from my understanding, the music was a part of conveying again a spiritual and universal message that will be true for all times. Um, Masters of War and songs advocating peace and the atrocities of those who betray or who manipulate, and trying to also bond people together in ways seen the seventh house, and releasing his own information that were other people's voices, trying this, trying that, but at the end, the Pluto in the eighth said, it's not really me. So it can be that process, and that was happening through the music, and progressively becoming self sustaining through that. So, any additions or any insight about Bob Dylan's chart?
Deva, in relation to his Pluto in the 8th house, I can see that he has Scorpio on 2 house cusps. How would you interpret that?
I would see that too, as I mean, through the and this is just from observing his life too. Seeing the 10th and the 11th is not having the external confrontations with authorities about what his music meant, what it didn't, what the structure of it was, what the specific label was, and kind of liberating from that. From my understanding, he did have a tendency to be he could be overpowering, or it was the sense of, with the eighth house, it could be a dynamic of trying to overpower those limits by blasting. Looking at the 10th house, and with the 11th house, transforming that or altering that through uh, allowing specifically his music to alter itself as it will. With the 11th house, liberating or kind of deconditioning from those power struggles. And he seemed to be an ally for those who were also liberating, deconditioning, and who were trying to be molded by those who they didn't want to be molded by. So it was that shift, I would say, from confronting or externalizing the power struggles that could happen, and more using those for liberation purposes, or using those to kind of untie from unnecessary confrontations. I would say too, looking at the balance of the chart, that he's certainly an advocate for the underdog. You can see that with Pisces and the Virgo energy. Also the Taurus, the Jupiter in Taurus trining the North Node on the 6th, 9th, advocating that um, an inner value, so to speak, or valuing the underdogs, and to help them rediscover what's true for them, what's their personal truth, and so on. Seeing the 9th house to discern that for themselves. So, okay, any questions or comments or insights into the 8th house, Pluto and Scorpio, or any of the materials so far? Okay, so thanks so much for the support and for joining in the Zoom meeting today. I look forward to meeting with you for the next time. Namaste.
Thank you, David. Thank you from all of us, and we'll see you next time for Pluto in Sag.